Amazing.
Complex.
Important.
Beautiful.
Foundational.
Fascinating.
Critical.
Necessary.
Integral to everything.
My name's Chris Philpott. I'm the Animal Immersion Program Supervisor here at Zoo Atlanta.
My name is Ellen Dimmitt. I'm a junior studying environmental sciences and biology at Emory, and I'm also an undergraduate research assistant.
I'm Barry Brosi. I'm an associate professor in the environmental sciences department at Emory University. So pollinator is any kind of animal that visits a flower and basically helps plants with this process of pollination, which is really critical for the reproduction of plants. So these are animals that are basically transferring pollen from one flower to another, and in so doing basically fertilizing those flowers and allowing them to produce seeds that can then generate the next generation of plants, and also often initiating the development of fruits. Pollinators contribute to about 1/3 of the calories that we consume, and that's due, and it's smaller, I think, than some people might think at first, because we get a lot of food in our diet from animal products, so meat and dairy and eggs and things like that. And we also get a substantial portion from grains, and most grains are actually pollinated by the wind, so we don't need animals to pollinate those. So that includes corn and rice and wheat, which really are major dietary staples. That remaining 30% of foods really represents most of the, or many of the vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds that we consume. And those foods are really disproportionately important for our diet in terms of providing vitamins and minerals and other micronutrients. Anyone who likes to eat should care about pollinators.
Bees and pollinators are really important to their ecosystems. I mean, if you think about it, they've been co-evolving with flowers, for millennia. There's just such a diverse group of them. Examples, they range from things like bees or even cockroaches in some parts of the world to things as big as lemurs. If you look at it and you take bees out of the equation, or just pollinators in general, some ecosystems would have some real trouble recovering and adapting from that. We have this real big focus on producing a lot of quantity for food and farming, and just in general, using all the land just for one thing. So we call those monocultures. So think about something like corn. If you're at a farm with corn, it's going to be, corn as far as the eye can see, or wheat. And these are things that don't require pollination from pollinators. So they're wind pollinated or self-pollinated. So, you have these acres, hundreds of thousands of acres of just food desert. So they're losing their habitat, but not only are they losing their habitat, we're also creating these food deserts. Almond crop in California, it's the single largest pollination event on the planet. And so California produces most of the world's almonds. They're good for the bees. It's full of protein in that pollen, which they need. But they only bloom, really bloom for a couple weeks out of the year. So in the United States here, we drive in hives from all over the country to manage this single pollination event in California. And, it's great for 2 weeks, but then after the 2 weeks and nothing's blooming, again, you have this, crop monoculture, and it's essentially a food desert. Outside of those 2 weeks, it's 800,000 acres of nothing for bees or other pollinators to eat.
Many people do not know that the honeybee is actually not native to North America. Our native pollinators are, ground nesting bees and bumblebees and stuff like that. And these species are, although it's great that honeybees are pollinators, we are seeing them kind of start to crowd out and outcompete a lot of our native bee species. which is problematic because it's important for us to have that diversity of different pollinators rather than one species which is in control of everything.
One of the important themes in our lab is that we're very interested in biodiversity. So, for example, how does the diversity of pollinators impact pollination functioning? The Rocky Mountain Biolab we abbreviate it as RMBL, its acronym, and we often refer to it as Rumble. So out at Rumble, bumblebees are really a very important group of pollinators, and that's in part due to the fact that we don't actually have honeybees there because it's too high elevation for them to survive at that altitude. There are up to 13 different species of bumblebees out at Rumble, so it's a very diverse collection of bumblebee species. 11 of them are sort of common. And what one of the experiments that we did out there is we would remove a single bumblebee species from field plots temporarily, with the idea of trying to understand if we reduce the diversity of these bumblebees, even by one species, does that have effects on pollination functioning? So we did these experiments. We repeated them with a number of different bumblebee species, sort of using the most common species that we found in a number of different sites. And we found that indeed, when we removed a single species, it actually changed the behavior of the remaining species in the system in a way to where the remaining pollinators were actually visiting different plant species on a single foraging trip. And so they're not doing as good a job as pollinators because they're transferring the wrong kind of pollen between the flowers. And that we were able to trace that basically from the behavior to the deposition of pollen on flowers, and then actually all the way back to the seed production in those plants, and showed that indeed when we removed a single species that we saw reductions in seed production in those plants.
I've been able to be involved in a lot of different projects that the Brosi Lab has been working on. When I came in as a freshman, I started out with helping with the processing of pollen samples as well as insect samples that were collected as a part of our projects that are going on out at Rumble to study the effects of changing climate on plant pollinator communities. An issue of growing concern in the ecological and I guess broader scientific community is that as climate is changing and average temperatures are increasing, we're starting to see a misalignment of the life events of plant species and their pollinators. For example, flower opening timing, or the timing of flowers opening, is dependent upon a lot of environmental cues that aren't exactly the same as those which determine the emergence of pollinators. So plants might open depending on how moist the soil is, whereas pollinators emerge more depending on temperature. And when those two things no longer match up, we have flowers blooming at a time where there's no pollinators to facilitate their reproduction, and we have pollinators emerging at a time where there's no flowers for them to source nectar and pollen from.
I was part of a global group of scientists that came together under the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This is a relatively new intergovernmental platform that was really modeled on the IPCC, which was focused on climate change. But this group is trying to understand, when we see changes to biodiversity and changes to ecosystem services, what are those changes going to be? What are the things that are driving those changes? And it's interesting to me that the very first assessment that this group took on was looking at pollinator declines. In terms of the threats that we came up with from that working group, climate change is certainly one. Pesticides is a really big threat to pollinators. And there's a relatively new class of pesticides called neonicotinoid pesticides that are really chemically modified versions of nicotine. And that class of pesticides was introduced in the mid-1990s and is now the most heavily used class of insecticides on Earth. We know that they're extremely toxic to pollinators and can affect their behavior even in very, very tiny doses. The neonicotinoid pesticides affect a particular acetylcholine receptor in the nervous system. And so in some ways it's potentially not surprising that they might impact behavior, just as, for example, nicotine use in humans can affect their behavior. It actually increases their metabolism. It also seems to disrupt their cognition, so their learning and their memory. And one of the things that we've seen in some pilot data from my lab is that bees that are exposed to neonicotinoid pesticides seem to be able to not integrate information appropriately when they're foraging with multiple other bee species, whereas on their own they do kind of okay, potentially some small reductions, but in this again diverse sort of biological community context, where it probably is more difficult to integrate information, that's where we really start to see some issues. Disease is actually another really big factor, and that's a factor that's been very much exacerbated by globalization and the increases in human movement around the globe. There are dozens and dozens of these diseases. Most of them are documented in honeybees, which are the most important species in terms of agricultural pollination, and certainly the most heavily managed pollinators on Earth. We see everything from external macro parasites like the varroa mite, which is one of the most important drivers of honeybee losses worldwide, to viruses, to bacteria, to fungal diseases, to microsporidian diseases. And one of the, I think, scary things with that is that, again, with globalization, these are just getting spread around the world much more rapidly. Those pathogens, diseases cause just tremendous amounts of colony loss around the world.
Here in the United States, we have 4,000 different species of bees, and I would say half of those were found to be in decline, and 25% of them approaching extinction. So you have all these native pollinators that have, evolved to fill some niche, and that's why their species has succeeded in the evolutionary game. If they're gone, that niche goes unfilled. But they have a great resilience to bounce back after these kinds of things. So if we, it's certainly not too late to save pollinators and bees. If we can just get people to understand and care, it's not beyond our reach to kind of make a difference. Some of the things that I've done to kind of help bees ever since I really got involved with it, I help care for the beehives here at the zoo. And so we work with a local university, Georgia Tech, to host a few hives on the roof. So we take care of those. They provide pollination service to the area, which is really cool to be a part of, and it's really cool to see the bees as they move around. And they also provide an opportunity for students to study them. I've also been a part of Bee City USA, the Atlanta affiliation. Bee City is basically a commitment to pollinators in your community. So really wants to focus on policy that helps protect pollinators and their habitats, creates new habitats, and also educate the public. I think that's a really important first step in helping pollinators.
I applied for and received last semester a $2,000 incentives fund grant to establish native pollinator gardens on campus to educate people in the Emory community about the importance of pollinators, as well as the beautiful diversity of native plant and pollinators that we have here in Atlanta, and additionally to restore some of the native pollinator habitat in the nature preserve, Lullwater, that we have on our campus.
We are seeing continued declines of pollinators, and I think one of the concerns of scientists is that this is going to have impacts on plant reproduction, potentially globally on our food production system. But a lot of those impacts might take quite a while to happen. And if we let our pollinator populations continue to decline, we could see some really catastrophic changes down the line in the future that are really sort of non-additive. So we should really take the precautionary principle and try and conserve pollinators given their importance to us as a species.
You can help native pollinators and just pollinators in general by changing up your lawn care practice at home. So if you own a yard, try to avoid using spray pesticides. It might kill those mosquitoes that drive you nuts, but it could also really do some damage to bees and other pollinators like butterflies. So instead of using spray chemicals, try using repellents. Off or citronella candles or oil. Plant native flowering plants for whatever region you live in. So plant abundant, diverse, and native, I would say, is a good way to take care of your backyard. Do your research, see if it's been treated with any kind of systemic pesticide before you buy it and plant it.
I think governments could actually step up in terms of policy and having a lot more rigor in terms of the movement of any kind of biological products. We have some biosafety measures in place that are run through the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services Division of USDA. So they're doing a good job, but I think those regulations, again, could be strengthened. Many of the threats that I've talked about, diseases being spread around by globalization, land use change, climate change, those are things that I think we can and should work on, but they're big, challenging problems. On the other hand, pesticides really are an enormous driving factor in terms of pollinator declines, and they're something that we are much more able to regulate. And so I think that's one of the places that we should look first. The European Union has regulated neonicotinoid insecticides in mass blooming crops that pollinators feed on, and they're now considering expanding that ban beyond just those crops. That's something that the United States has yet to do. We can and should think about stronger regulations for pesticides, and that doesn't necessarily mean giving them up altogether, but thinking about what are less harmful, for example, alternatives that conventional growers could use, and funding more research to understand these threats better so that we make sure that we have pollinator populations moving forward. Vote with your fork. So in terms of choosing foods that are supportive for pollinators. So going to your farmer's market, eating local, eating organic, that can make a really big difference for pollinators.
So honey is a really popular commodity, and it has been for a really long time. However, almost all of the honey that you'll find at your average grocery store is not entirely real honey. A lot of it's diluted with other sugary syrups that you wouldn't be able to tell, and also a lot of it, or almost none of it, is sourced locally. So it's very important to make sure that you're sourcing your honey and pollen and any sort of bee products from local beekeepers who are keeping their bees in an ethical and sustainable way, especially since the global honey trade is so problematic for, the well-being and the success of smaller scale beekeeping operations that are actually doing a lot to support native bee populations and just pollinators in general. At a smaller scale beekeeping operation, the stakes are a lot higher if you lose a hive, so those people are more invested in making sure that their hives are happy and healthy, as well as producing honey for them. And also those people are doing a lot for local agriculture as well, because the way that you get different variations of honey is by having the bees source the pollen from and the nectar of different flower species. So when farmers want a diversity of different honey flavors to offer, they'll expose their bee colonies to foraging opportunities at a bunch of different plants, and thus they'll be growing those plants. I think that every organism on our planet has intrinsic value independent of its utility to humans. I don't think that there's any reason why we should only see the utility of pollinators as what they can do for us. They're a creature that's really, really suffering as a result of our presence. So I think that it's our ethical obligation as another species sharing this planet with so many others to make sure that we're living in harmony as much as possible with species like pollinators.